my slides. So we had been kind of in the middle of talking about definitions of how people transfer infectious disease to each other. And I'm going to slightly back up a little bit. I'm going to start here and then back up a little bit back to direct contact because I was kind of rushing. Speaking of rushing, I was rushing at the end of last class. Okay, so there are most of the time when people transmit to diseases to each other, it has nothing to do with a parent-child relationship between the people. So let me clarify what I mean by that. There is one mode of transmitting infectious disease person to person that's called vertical. And vertical transmission depends on parent-child connection for transmission. And that is because vertical transmission of disease is coming through basically 4 reproductive related methods. So it's coming through the placenta. So a woman is pregnant and she has a placenta structure between her and the embryo or between her and the fetus. And there are some diseases that can be passed from mom to fetus through the placenta. It's not a lot, but it's some. And that's kind of a special category of transmission that falls into vertical. The second way that vertical transmission can happen is through breast milk. And this definition is assuming that the breast milk is not donated, but it's coming straight out of the mom's body into the child's mouth. So that depends on specific parent-child relationship, vertical transmission of a child you are literally breastfeeding. And then there are just a few, not many, so few diseases that can be transmitted through eggs. Like an infected egg gives rise to an infected embryo, or an infected sperm gives rise to an infected embryo, but that's really rare for infectious disease. But diseases that are passed based on that relationship are called vertical, or examples of vertical transmission. If the disease is not being passed through these mechanisms, it's not vertical transmission, it's horizontal. So we can think of horizontal as kind of the normal person to person method. And if my child vomits in my face, that is horizontal transmission because it could have been anybody vomiting in my face or sneezing on me or coughing on me. So not every disease passed between parent and child is vertical. That's like a special case. Most of the time, people passing diseases to each other is horizontal. So horizontal can be subdivided into 2 methods. So all these methods are person to person, but we can subdivide into direct contact or indirect contact. And this is kind of where I'm backing up to last time to say direct contact involves exchange of fluids. And it involves some kind of close proximity to another person. And in your book, they're putting all of these different methods into a big table that covers a whole page. And it is listing here and showing some pictures of people with direct transmission to each other. So kissing, sharing a drink, sexual transmitted diseases fall into direct. If you spray, if you sneeze, cough, vomit, and it produces wet droplets that hang in the air and somebody else breathes them in right then, that's direct. So make a note here that droplet transmission is a version of direct transmission. So if the transmission is not direct and it's not with close contact between people and they're not exchanging fluids in a short amount of time, then it is indirect. And indirect, like the way I think about indirect is, this is how you get diseases when you didn't even know the person, you weren't really in contact with them. It came to you in a very indirect manner, indirect transmission. So again, this table in your book is helpful to describe the methods of indirect, but the font is so tiny. Indirect includes vector transmission. Did we talk about vector transmission last time? Like there's a insect, there's a tick, something like that? Okay, couldn't remember if we did. So indirect includes within that category vector transmission. Vector transmission is when an insect or arthropod, you know, like a spider and a tick is not actually not an insect. They're not. They're not. Transmits microbes to a person. That's vector transmission. So we would say that the mosquito, sorry, this is the mosquito. The mosquito is a vector for transmitting malaria, and that's an indirect contact. People don't really give each other malaria. It passes person to person through a mosquito, so that's indirect. Flies landing on your food and vomiting on it or whatever they're doing, that's indirect, but it's using vector transmission. Other ways of indirect transmission include vehicle. So I'm gonna put that over here, vehicle transmission. Vehicle transmission is when you indirectly get infected by air, not big mucus droplets in the air, but smaller dried out stuff in the air, so to speak. Water, soil, or contaminated food. And these, you might recognize, we also called those reservoirs. So some of these terms kind of overlap with each other. We can breathe contaminated air, we can drink contaminated water, we can get dirt in a wound and catch an infection that way. All of those are indirect. So these are also considered reservoirs too. Foodborne infections are common and are serious, and they contain a subcategory, which is gross but commonly happens, of fecal oral transmission. Fecal oral transmission tends to happen when people are not using the best hygiene after they defecate and not washing their hands or not wearing gloves when you're changing diapers in a daycare. And eventually some of those gut microbes, like we've been studying in lab, move from fecal matter into a person's mouth. The good news is your stomach acid will kill most of that stuff, but not everything. So fecal oral contamination is indirect. It's classified as indirect, and it gets its own special category here in this box, calling it fecal oral route of transmission. For hospital patients, patients that are having really bad diarrhea, that's a higher risk that just from the amount of it, there could be fecal oral infection route in the hospital. If you use your correct techniques and listen to your hygiene control, infection control nurse, less likely. Okay. And then we have one more term that goes with indirect, which is fomite. I think this word is so funny. Fomites are inanimate objects that can have infectious microbes on them. So it's not air, it's not water, it's not soil, it's things. So a thing that is not food, water, soil, or air. So this could be doorknob, a handle, a surface that we touch. Like if there are microbes here and then I pick my nose and infect myself, surface, spoon, an object. Needles that you might come across and accidentally stick yourself with that did not just touch someone else's blood and go into yours, that would be a fomite. That would be a fomite. What else do like people worry about getting diseases from toilet seats? That can be a fomite, but that's not as common as you might think. Keyboard, fomite, is an object that could have microbes on it. And fomites are classified as a way of indirect transmission. So I know that in this section, we have used so many definitions to talk about infections and how people can get infections and how to classify them that instead of asking you all to define for me all these definitions and write them on a test, what I like to do is make a word bank of these and then put scenarios of people catching disease and have you pick out from the word bank how many of these apply to that situation. And so these are questions that I pulled from old tests that I thought the questions are okay, but not amazing. And then I make them into practice questions. So what we're going to do the rest of this time is to go through these and kind of look at these terms and look at these scenarios and then talk through some of them to describe which words would you pick out? Why did you pick that? And that's what we'll do for practice. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to kind of look over these and just read them. And then I'll pick out probably 3 to do now. And then we can talk about the other 3 I guess tomorrow for class. And get those pulled up on the screen too. I think that I tried to do this before I printed them out and it made the formatting all wonky to also have vehicle on that list, vehicle transmission. Okay, I want to start with C because C has more information and C has more things that would apply to it. So see if I can make this a little bit smaller so we can fit both the word bank and the question. We all have the question. I'm gonna make the word bank a little bit bigger. Okay, so we have a patient care tech taking care of someone that has diarrhea. She didn't wash her hands before she goes to the next patient. The next patient also develops diarrhea. And that patient number 2 has salmonella and E. coli in their gut. And eventually, patient number 2 dies from endotoxic shock. Okay. So, looking at that, is this direct or indirect? Why direct? It's probably fecal oral. Probably fecal oral, which is indirect. So every scenario, you're either going to have direct or indirect. So in this one, on part C, it is indirect, so it cannot also be direct. So that eliminates that one. Okay. Is it vertical or is it horizontal? Horizontal. This is horizontal. Unless patient number, well, even if patient number 1 and number 2 were parent and child, this transmission is not dependent on that. So this is horizontal. I'm gonna draw the line through. You got horizontal. Does patient number 2 have a mixed infection? Yeah, 2 different things. Yes, they do. So patient number 2 does have a mixed infection. They've got 2 things at once. Patient number 1, we don't actually know. Like, I don't have that information up there. It's possible that patient number 1 had a unmixed infection. Let's keep focusing on patient number 2. Where is their infection? Is it local? Is it focal? Or is it systemic? It's a tough one. They do have a systemic because they have endotoxic shock. They have a systemic infection that at one point was local. So if you put local, like I try to think about like, was that a part of what's going on at some point? Yes, it was. So it started out in their gut as a mixed infection, and eventually it got into their bloodstream and it became systemic. So it was both at one point or another. We know it's not vertical. Are there any animals involved with this? No. So this is not zoonotic. It wasn't direct. What about fomite? Let's find. Oh, I think I see a fomite. Wouldn't the pill be? The pills. Yeah. The pills. The pills are a fomite. So that's involved. This scenario, there probably was a primary infection. We don't know which thing caused it. Make yourself a note on this page. The first thing that a person gets infected with is always a primary infection. So every scenario that you see in this test or elsewhere, like there's always a primary infection. There may or may not be a secondary. This scenario, the way I've written it, it's hard to tell whether that's a secondary infection or they just got both of them by circumstance. So we'll look at an example of secondary with our next scenario. Not vertical, not zoonotic. We had a fomite. So that C part could have had seven answers to it. And the way that I set up this on the test is I will give you a certain number of scenarios and I count up how many correct answers there are. And then I assign the whole page points. And then if you get more than the assigned number, which is less than how many, it becomes bonus. So for example, if the test had all of these questions together and that's a 20-point thing, there's way more than 20 right answers. So if you had 27, like I think I'd do the extra or half a point bonus each or something like that. So you don't have to get every single thing on every single question, but a certain number across the whole page. Yeah.
Is passive carrier and passive transmission?
Yes, that is happening here. The nurse is a passive carrier. It's definitely passive. It's passive because she's not infected. It's just on her. It's on her hand. It's on the pill. She's a passive carrier. Yeah.
Would it also be vehicle transmission?
It could be. It could be.
No.
It could be. So what I do when the ones I put on the test have a lot more detail than this. These are ones that kind of like, well, I didn't really include everything about what happened.
I hate this word.
So wrong.
Would the pills be contaminated?
The pills are contaminated, but they're an object. They're a fomite. Yeah. But it could have been that the first patient drank water that gave them E. coli, and that could have been a vehicle, but really explained in the prompt. So I try to over time write better prompts. And then if I look at what you put and that technically could have happened somewhere, I will usually count it. Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. Okay, so the other most complicated one is E, about the friends with the Gatorade. I actually thought that this happened to my child before, and then I like added on some more scary details that didn't actually happen, but I got freaked out about this one time. The friends with the Gatorade. So scroll to that one and we'll use the list again. Okay, the friends are sharing a drink. Friend number one gets strep. So they have group A strep, test positive for that. Friend number two also gets a sore throat, doesn't have insurance, doesn't go to get checked out. Seems like his sore throat goes away, but then later on, he gets an infection of his heart valves, also with strep pyogenes. Okay, yeah, the back is, yeah, back has some few extra helpful facts.
Were the local, focal, and systemic on our last slide set? Or were they on these?
Local, focal, systemic, it's been a little while. They're on a gingerbread man.
I was on the-
I remember that. Yeah. Yeah, that's probably in that first slide set, actually. Local, focal, systemic. This one has a focal. So we have an infection moving from one spot, which was local, so sore throat, that's the local infection. And the friend that has the heart valve infection, that one was focal.
So we were to do it for both patients. Yeah, that's what I'm.
You can include both patients. Yeah.
You do it for both patients, you want to be like local.
No, I don't even track it that closely. Cause it takes a while to grade these. Like I have to set aside some time and I read what you're writing and then if you put one that I'm not expecting, I'll think about it. It's like, could that happen? What was your question you just said?
I was just doing the second one at first, but.
It kind of depends on how much time you have and,
Okay.
yeah. Um. So, you know, you don't need to like agonize about it, but yeah. The way I approach stuff like this is I kind of look at the list and it's like, is that happening? Some of them definitely are, some of them definitely not. But this is an example of focal. It did not get systemic. It did not really get systemic, so it's not a blood infection. But it did go to his heart valves for friend number 2. Is this vertical or horizontal? This is definitely horizontal. Definitely horizontal. Is it direct or indirect?
Direct.
It's direct because they shared spit basically on a bottle, so direct. If somebody put fomite because they think the bottle is a fomite, that I would probably just leave that alone and not count it right or wrong, but it's really spit on the bottle and it's direct, and so fomite, we kind of associate that with indirect, but so I wouldn't put it, but I also wouldn't count it wrong. Do we have any evidence that there's a mixed infection going on? We don't see two different strain names, so I wouldn't assume mixed. It's probably not passive. You know how this transmitted, it was direct. And passive is a subcategory of indirect. Is there a primary infection? There's always a primary infection, so if you don't know anything else, put primary infection. Does there seem to be a secondary?
Where it turned into like the next fever, would that be? It's a different problem, but it's the same bacteria.
Okay.
So this is not a secondary infection. Secondary is when the first one causes a problem
So
that lets.
when
the
there's a second, if there was to become a second bacteria,
Yeah.
it would be the.
Let's make a note of that. A secondary infection requires a different strain. So you can have one strain moving around the body and causing problems in different areas, but that's not a secondary infection. That's a focal infection that came from somewhere else. It's not really systemic. It's not vertical. We don't have any animal involved, so it's not zoonotic. Your all's paper has vector on it, doesn't it?
Yes.
I added that and I didn't change it in the canvas. Is there a vector? No. Yeah, there's no insect or tick or spider involved. On this, so you guys can practice these other ones. The other ones have kind of less detail. Some of them are almost too simplistic, but F is very good. I would encourage you to look at F and think about what's going on there and how many terms could you get. The other ones are not gonna have as many definite things because the descriptions are so short, but this is the kind of thing we'll have about this many and they have more detail, but that would be on Friday test.
So will the ones on Friday be like multiple, like, oh, these are,
They all will have multiple.
so like A, I've just got one so far. So on Friday,
Yeah, what do you have so far?
uh,
It's vertical, yeah.
and then.
A is not a great question because you can't really tell much and I haven't taught y'all about chlamydia. So, yeah,
That's what I didn't know on Friday that would be just,
it's a primary. It's vertical. But you really can't tell much more than that
yeah, that's.
based on what I wrote down there, which is why I stopped using that on the test. Like, it's too vague. Needs more detail. Yeah. Thank you all. I'll see you tomorrow.